A white bank manager refused to process a check for a black client, humiliating her and casting doubt on the legitimacy of her funds. What he failed to realize was that she owned the bank. What unfolded next would astonish even the most seasoned observers. But let's rewind to the beginning. For Mr. Richard Calloway, the manager of an esteemed downtown bank, the day started like any other. The building's grand white pillars shimmered under the morning sun, a testament to its stature. Richard prepared for another routine day, handling wealthy clients and adhering to processes that reinforced his confidence in his prominent role in the financial sector. Then she walked in. Her tall frame and assured stride immediately caught the attention of customers and employees alike. Dressed in an impeccable business suit and holding a high-end leather briefcase, she exuded an air of authority. Approaching the counter with poise, she spoke in an even tone. "Good morning. I'd like to deposit this check into my account." She handed the check to the young teller with precision. The teller's eyes widened momentarily at the substantial figure written on the check. Regaining her composure, she said, almost in a whisper, "Ma'am, this is a very large amount. I'll need to direct you to our manager for further assistance." The woman nodded without hesitation, her expression unwavering, and followed the teller toward the manager's office. "Mr. Calloway, there's a customer here with a sizable check," the teller informed him. Richard glanced up from his papers. His face darkened momentarily as he sized up the visitor. Years in banking had taught him to assess clients quickly, and something about this one struck him as unusual for his branch. Nevertheless, he concealed his thoughts behind a mask of professionalism. "How may I assist you?" he asked, his tone brisk as his gaze briefly met hers, before drifting to the check she placed on his desk. "I'd like to deposit this check into my account," she repeated evenly. Richard picked up the document, examining it with thinly veiled skepticism. "This is quite a significant amount," he remarked, his voice low. "I'll need to verify the origin of these funds. It's standard procedure." Remaining composed, the woman replied, "All the necessary details and contact information are on the check. You can verify with my legal representatives." Despite her clear response, Richard frowned. "Even so, I'll have to postpone this transaction for additional verification. Perhaps you could provide further evidence of your business's legitimacy." Her brows knitted slightly, but her tone didn't waver. "My business is fully compliant with the law. You already have everything required to process this transaction. I expect it to be handled without delay." Richard's demeanor stiffened as he raised his voice slightly. "I'll decide how and when transactions are processed here." His sharp tone drew the subtle attention of employees, who peeked from behind their desks. At this juncture, the young teller, Eliza, cautiously intervened. "Mr. Calloway, I've seen this client conduct substantial transactions here before. Her name is well known to us." "Eliza, you're dismissed," Richard snapped, his tone icy. Turning back to the client, he added, "If you're dissatisfied, you're free to file a complaint. However, I reserve the right to investigate any check that raises suspicion." The woman exhaled slowly, keeping her composure intact. "Very well," she said, pulling out her phone. "If you cannot facilitate this transaction, I'll escalate the matter to the bank's leadership. I'm certain they'll have an interest in your approach." Richard continued scrutinizing the check, ignoring the mounting tension in the room. "Look, Miss," he deliberately avoided using her name, despite having her documents in front of him. "I'm just following protocol. Verification is mandatory for such sums." "I understand your concern for due diligence, Mr. Calloway," she replied coolly, folding her hands atop her briefcase. "But I suspect this delay is inconsistent with the bank's internal standards. You have everything you need. So, what's the issue?" Richard hesitated briefly before replying, his tone harsher. "The issue is that sums like this aren't typical for clients like you. Do you understand?" Her eyes narrowed for a split second, but she maintained her composure. Without another word, she unlocked her phone. "Fine. If you're unwilling to process this transaction, I'll call someone who will." The transaction was processed immediately. "Please, wait in the lounge. I'll oversee this matter personally," Jean Ellis assured. As the client exited the office, her gaze lingered on Richard Calloway for a moment. A silent but piercing look that left no doubt this situation was far from over. "John, I was only—" Richard began to explain, but John silenced him with an authoritative gesture. "You've made a grave mistake," she said sharply, "and there will be consequences." Richard's face turned ashen as he realized the gravity of the unfolding situation. Left alone in his office, he felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. Desperation clawed at his thoughts as he scrambled to construct an excuse, but deep down, he knew it was too late. His actions had already put his position in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Jean escorted Cynthia Brooks into the conference room, her demeanor professional yet apologetic. Offering Cynthia a glass of water, she reassured her, "This issue will be resolved immediately. Please rest assured." Back in his office, Richard paced nervously, trying to maintain his composure. Moments later, Jean re-entered with a firm expression, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. "Richard," she began without preamble, "do you even realize who you were speaking to?" She presented a suspicious check. Richard replied defensively, striving to mask his anxiety. "Am I not supposed to verify large sums?" Jean's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice laden with incredulity. "That so-called suspicious check came directly from her corporate account. Let me ask you, why did you feel verification was necessary? Is this standard protocol for all clients? Or did you apply a different set of rules this time?" Richard stammered, mumbling something incoherent about procedures and safety, but Jean cut him off sharply. "Enough. You didn't even bother to review her portfolio." She tossed a thick folder onto his desk with an air of finality. "Let me remind you who Cynthia Brooks is. She's the largest shareholder of this bank. She holds a controlling stake, and with one phone call, she could remove you from your position." The blood drained from Richard's face. There must be some mistake," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no mistake," Jean snapped. "And do you know what's worse? This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. You let your prejudices cloud your decisions. That's unacceptable." Meanwhile, in the conference room, Cynthia sat calmly reviewing her documents. Her sharp gaze betrayed her focus, but her demeanor remained poised. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Eliza, carefully balancing a tray with a glass of water and a folder. "Miss Brooks," Eliza said softly, "I apologize for the interruption. I just wanted to thank you for your patience." Cynthia's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Eliza. I noticed your efforts to help. That says a great deal about your character." After Eliza left, Cynthia reached for her phone and dialed a number. Her voice was composed but resolute. "Janet, it's Cynthia. I need you to assemble the leadership team immediately. We need to address an issue at one of our branches. Yes, it's urgent." A short while later, Jean returned to the conference room, her face still taut with tension. "Miss Brooks," she began, "everything has been processed. Your check is now deposited. Please accept my deepest apologies for what happened." Cynthia stood, gathering her belongings. Her tone was measured yet firm as she replied, "Thank you, Jean, but this isn't something I can overlook. There will need to be a serious conversation about this incident." As Cynthia exited the branch, every eye in the room followed her, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Richard, standing by the window of his office, could do nothing but watch helplessly as his career unraveled before his eyes. The next day, Cynthia Brooks sat in the expansive conference room of the bank's headquarters. Across from her sat key figures of the management team, including Jean Ellis, who looked visibly uneasy, and Richard Calloway, whose attempts to salvage his dignity were thinly veiled. Cynthia spoke with an air of authority, her calm voice cutting through the room. "Yesterday's incident wasn't just a mistake. It's indicative of a systemic issue. As the largest shareholder, I consider it my responsibility to address this head-on." Her gaze shifted to John. "You are a competent professional, but it's your duty to ensure that every branch upholds principles of respect and equality. What happened yesterday was unacceptable." Jean nodded, her expression somber, but Richard attempted to interject. "Miss Brooks, if I may, it was simply standard procedure." "There was no intent." Cynthia raised her hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Don't attempt to justify your actions, Richard. Your so-called standard procedure was selective. You disregarded my documentation, leaned on baseless assumptions, and failed in your duties. This isn't about protocol, it's about your bias. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but faltered under her piercing gaze. Cynthia continued, addressing the rest of the room. This bank thrives on trust. If incidents like this are allowed to persist, we risk eroding that trust entirely. This is not just about one individual. It's a reflection of the system. That's why I'm proposing concrete reforms. She laid out a series of documents on the table. First, all staff will undergo mandatory training on inclusion and cultural competence. Second, internal procedures will be reviewed to eliminate biases. Third, we will establish a robust system for complaints, accessible to both clients and employees. These measures will be implemented within the month. The management team murmured among themselves, clearly in agreement with her proposal. Jean was the first to voice her support. This is a necessary step. We can't afford to let incidents like this tarnish our reputation. Cynthia turned her focus back to Richard. You understand you can't remain in your position after this, don't you? Richard, now pale and visibly shaken, nodded silently. You have two options, Cynthia said. Resign with a letter of recommendation or face an internal investigation. I suggest you think carefully. As the meeting concluded, Cynthia left the room feeling a sense of accomplishment, though she knew her work wasn't done. Later that day, she returned to the branch where the events had unfolded. Eliza noticed her arrival and cautiously approached. Miss Brooks, Eliza said with a hint of nervousness, it's good to see you again. Cynthia offered her a warm smile. Thank you, Eliza. Eliza, Cynthia began, her tone warm but assertive. I noticed the courage you displayed when you tried to intervene earlier. That's a quality this bank desperately needs more of. If you're interested in advancing your career, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I believe there's plenty of room here for employees like you. Eliza's cheeks flushed with surprise and gratitude. She managed a shy smile, her voice barely audible. Thank you, Miss Brooks. That means a lot. Cynthia gave her a reassuring nod before turning to leave. The bank lobby was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on her as she strode out with a poise and confidence that was impossible to ignore. Her presence commanded respect, and her actions that day left an indelible impression on everyone present. For Cynthia, this wasn't just her bank. It had become a beacon, a representation of how one individual's determination could transform an entire institution. Her actions spoke volumes, reminding everyone that change starts with accountability, and integrity could reshape even the most rigid systems. Outside, the sun cast a golden glow over the bank's grand exterior as Cynthia departed, her head held high. The events of the day would ripple far beyond the walls of that branch, serving as a powerful testament to the importance of leadership, fairness, and unwavering principles.